Okay then, right, where are we? Okay, so for the second part of the evidence session on the Scottish Budget 25-26, I welcome to the meeting Shona Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, who's joined by Scottish Government officials, Jenny Baroud, Director of Exchequer Strategy, Richard McCallum, Director of Public Spending, Ellen Lever, Acting Director for Local Government, and Lorraine King, Deputy Director, Track Strategy, Engagement and Performance. Given the time constraints, we'll dispense with the opening statement, and I'd like to open up the session myself with a number of questions. First of all, I mean, looking at the draft budget, I think there's a lot that stakeholders will be pleased with. Health and social care is up 9.8%, ferry services 22.7%, housing a whopping 57%, and justice and local government all have significant increases in resource relative to last year, budget to budget. However, Cabinet Secretary, there is some confusion. The committee last year asked for the autumn budget revision numbers to be used as a baseline, but without making adjustments to strip out routine in-year transfers, because this makes it difficult for the committee to see clearly exactly what is going. So it would be good if that was remedied for next year. Are there any plans to do that, just to make scrutiny easier for the committee?
So, obviously we took the request from FPAC, and first of all, let's put on the record my apologies for lateness and all of that, and keeping people waiting. But in line with the request from FPAC, we provided the comparative information in the budget document to show the latest approved budget position, which is obviously the autumn budget revision. Now, I am very happy to reflect on what more needs to be done. I think that there's been a recognition of the improvement in the position from last year, but that there are still issues around in-year transfers. Some of that is quite difficult to resolve because the policy, the issue will sit within that policy, and then the money will transfer in year. But we have baselined further funding. But if there's more improvements to be made, I'm very happy to work with FPAC around what those further improvements need to be.
Yeah, I mean, we raise this with the Minister for Finance every year, the fact that the same budgets have the same money taken out year in, year out, and it just seems to us to be a kind of wrong way of actually setting up the budgets, because we're not given an accurate picture of what the budget is. And I think for everyone's perspective, transparency is important. Similarly, last year I raised the issue of public-private partnership payments. These were listed as being £133.9 million this year for the trunk road network. And that was much the same as last year. However, it's only seen in trace amounts across the budget document. So this is despite a written answer from you last week that £14,699 million in PPP payments remain outstanding. So as agreed last year, should appropriate figures not be shown across all portfolios so that we can compare and in the interest of transparency? And so why is it not in this year's figures across each portfolio?
Well, look, again, if there are areas where we can improve transparency, I'm more than happy to do so. The PQ answers that you received, Convener, obviously set out the detail. But again, if there are improvements that we can make, whether it's on the PPP costs or anything else, happy to do that. I'm just reflective of, if I can give one example in response to your first question around, take nursing education, for example. The policy of how many nursing numbers is required sits with health, but the money then moves to education. And I just think there are some areas where it would be tricky to baseline because the policy so clearly sits within, in that case, health. But whether it's on PPP costs or whether it's on some of the further baselining at the start of the budget process, happy to reflect on that. I think we have had commentary, I think it was the SFC that said that there had been improvements in the transparency of the budget, but that there was obviously still work to be done, and happy to work with the committee.
It certainly has been in terms of autumn and spring revisions, but this was an issue I raised last year, and he said that, that it would be changed, and nothing has been changed. That's why I raise it again and hope not to have to raise it again next year.
I'll pick that up.
Now, how much of next year's budget will be mitigation of UK policies, and what's the impact on devolved services of that?
So there is an impact, particularly around welfare. I do have the figures somewhere in here around the mitigation of discretionary housing payments, for example, the mitigation of other welfare policies, which are substantial. I think the last figure was 140 million. Let me see if folk can find the figure. And that is money, obviously, that would otherwise be able to be used for other policy areas. But we feel very strongly that in the absence of any action, if you take the action we've taken on the bedroom tax, the action we're taking on child poverty, in the absence of UK government action, we've decided to prioritise that spend in order to, for example, help to tackle child poverty and meet the statutory child poverty targets. But they are obviously substantial costs. I'm sure we'll come on to the two-child cap. That's obviously a mitigation that will largely come out of the 26-27 budget.
Yeah, I mean, it means obviously, if you've got a relatively fixed budget, if you're spending on A, you can't spend it on B, and I mean, there's obviously a concern in local government and other areas that they are not getting as much as they would otherwise receive because money is being spent on areas which are reserved to Westminster for good or for ill, and that perhaps the Parliament should focus on its devolved responsibilities. If people are unhappy with Westminster policies, then they have an opportunity to vote one way or the other at an election, surely. Now, going on to the issue of welfare, which you just touched on, the Scottish Fiscal Commission has understandably expressed concern that social security spending continues to rise steadily, such that next year it will be £1,334 million higher than if welfare payments remained at UK levels. And when one considers social security spending, this means that the overall increase in funding in real terms is only up. Is actually going down by 0.3% in real terms. And I'll touch on one or two areas where that's happening in a moment. Now, with the following year, social security spending is expected to rise to £1,608 million. So, given Scottish ministers will not change tax rates, although fiscal drag will impact all but the two lowest bands, how can this be funded without cuts to existing services?
So, first of all, as I said earlier, we do regard investment in social security, including some of the mitigations I mentioned earlier, as an investment not just in people and in anti-poverty measures, but also if you give children the best start in life, they're more likely to be economically productive later in life. So you could argue that it's an investment in society that will give economic returns later on. I guess my answer to that would be, well, it is about prioritisation. So we're prioritising not just social security spend, but frontline services. The action we're taking on fiscal sustainability covers a number of areas in order to make sure that going forward we can afford the supports that we are providing. So there's a kind of 7 areas to that. I'll just give you the headlines, but workforce and the recruitment controls, the changes that we'll be making, particularly around backroom services, so that we can prioritise funding for frontline public service reform programme, which Ivan McKee has given you a fair amount of detail. The decisions we've previously taken on tax, of course, provide an additional £1.7 billion in 25-26, compared to if we'd matched the UK government policy, as according to SFC estimates. The work that we're doing to boost the economy and grow the economy, and the investments in this budget will help to do that. The Invest to Save Fund, working to release more funding. I think the efficiencies that Ivan McKee has set out amount to about £280 million over the last 2 years and another £300 million over the next 2 years. But the Invest to Save fund will go further than that. And then things like health and social care reform, all of which I guess I'm laying out because all of these pillars will be part of the Sustainability Delivery Plan that I'll bring more detail to align with MTFS, because there's a lot happening across government. What I'm keen to do is to give transparency to that and to set it all out in the one place. And that's what the Sustainability Delivery Plan will do. And we'll publish that alongside MTFS.
Okay. Now, regarding the lifting of the two-child cap, which the First Minister said will be brought in before 26-27, if that's possible, the Scottish Fiscal Commission has said that funding will be awarded to the families of 43,000 children at a cost of £155 million. Now, that equates to over £3,600 per child, including, obviously, the administration costs of delivering that. So that's almost nearly £70 a week a child. Are those figures correct? Because it seems an awful lot.
Yep, those figures are correct, and it will lift around 15,000 children out of poverty. So it will help many more families than that, but the estimate is it will lift 15,000 children out of poverty. Bearing in mind these are some of the poorest families, so it will be game-changing. And in terms of our statutory duty to tackle child poverty, we think this will be the most impactful lever on the back of other measures we've taken, like Scottish Child Payment, free school meals and so on. But we believe that this will be the most impactful lever beyond what we've done already to help lift some of the poorest families out of poverty.
And what will be the impact on incentivising people to go back into work?
Well, we're very conscious of that, and some of the SFC analysis began to look at that, but I suspect they will do more of this, and they were looking at some behavioural changes. We've been very cognisant of that in relation to the Scottish Child Payment, and we do look at any research, any evidence that would suggest that there's a cliff edge. But bearing in mind, I mean, this is a penalty on families with more than 2 kids, which means that at the moment the universal credit system does not recognise the costs of children beyond 2 children. We believe that is.
But one can argue a teacher, half of whose salary over 43,000 goes in tax, national insurance, might decide whether they can afford 1 or 2. An extra child, and they don't have access to those funds, additional funds, for example. So a lot of people who are in work resent this, which is why this policy is actually unpopular with the majority of voters, as all polls have shown, because people who are working have to decide, can I afford another child, and they see rightly or wrongly that people who are not working may be able to access benefits that they cannot in terms of deciding whether to expand their family or not.
Well, first of all, let me say, as I've said I think many times at this committee, that work is the best route out of poverty. Absolutely is. And we want to support families into work through whether it's employability or through support through childcare. And there's a lot of work going on to support those families who you might describe as furthest from the labour market, to break the cycle of poverty, and work is the best way to do that. But the issue in the here and now is that those families with more than 2 children are struggling because the costs are not being recognised by the UK social security system. And I guess the question for society is, well, the societal impacts of children living in poverty, because it's children who suffer at the end of the day, then the later impacts of those children living in poverty and the cycle of poverty continuing will be that they're less chance of becoming fully contributing members of society, contributing to the economy, working, having a good output from education, and all of the social impacts and societal impacts that come from poverty and child poverty. So the judgment is this fundamentally, is that an investment that we should make in order to break that cycle of poverty and lift children out of poverty, because we know that there's a societal benefit and an economic benefit from that. We believe that to be the case. We would rather the UK government change the policy, and that's why all of the child poverty organisations have focused their attention on this, because the evidence is it will have the biggest impact on the remaining child poverty rates that we have, which I think everybody accepts are too high, and we need to do something about it. So if not this, then I guess the question is what, and the evidence is this will have an impact.
Okay, Scotland has an economic performance gap where by slower economic growth means Scotland will raise £1,676 million in income tax, more than if it was following UK policies in 25-26, but benefited by only £838 million. So what steps are being taken to close that economic performance gap?
The net position, of course, is a product of two sets of forecasts from the SFC, but also the OBR. And Scottish income tax is forecast to grow strongly and raise a record £20.5 billion in 25-26, which is £745 million more than the SFC forecast at the Scottish Budget last year. But of course, at the same time, the OBR has significantly revised up their forecast of income tax in the rest of the UK. And given the way the framework works, that is the outcome. But we're committed to growing our economy, and the income tax net position is forecast to increase in each year of the forecast horizon. So that is a positive, but because of the OBR forecast revision, it has obviously moderated what that positive net position is. Well,
tax has gone up because of things like fiscal drag as much as anything else, but it's about the gap closing, so that the amount raised in extra tax is actually being spent in services, and only half is at the moment. Now, I want to go on to an area that I think is very much related to this. I mean, in education, we're seeing the workforce, infrastructure and digital budget more than double, up 114% to £586 million. I'm not really sure what that entails, so you might be able to tell us a wee bit more detail about that. Certainly, it seems to me very positive. However, college budgets have been reduced yet again and have fallen 17% in real terms in 4 years, according to Audit Scotland. Now, in my area, Ayrshire College needs additional revenue to deliver 250 training places for the aerospace sector. At Hunterston, it's anticipated 3,500 jobs will be created over the next few years, backed by £3.5 billion of investment. But at present, Ayrshire College faces reducing the number of engineering apprentices, despite employers requesting 50 places more than they've been funded for. So colleges are, I think I take on board what you're saying about money going into areas such as child poverty, but people who live in deprived areas have opportunities to get high quality engineering apprentices, and they can't because they're not being funded properly. So how do we boost the economy, close the employment gap, and give people a better future if Ayrshire and other colleges are expected to make year-on-year savings from things such as engineering apprenticeships?
Okay, well, first of all, I think some of the investments made by this budget are made in order to help grow the economy. So whether it's the green energy investment, whether it's the enterprise investments, the infrastructure investments, the investment in affordable housing, the investments in transport, in other major infrastructure will help to boost the economy, and particularly help to boost the construction sector. And actually, just before I move on to colleges, there are some very positive signs in the Scottish economy, despite the challenges we've just rehearsed, and that is that productivity has grown compared to the rest of the UK. The GDP per capita has grown faster than the UK's since 2007. We've got higher levels of inward investment, a record number of FDIs, and we're very strong in the key sectors of the economy. So it's not to minimise the point about, if if the OBR are showing that there's relative stronger growth, but the Scottish economy underlying that has improved markedly. So I think it's important to recognise that.
Sorry, but I think we could close that gap much quicker if we were actually investing in areas that were more worth creating, surely. So, sorry, I should let you finish your answer.
Well, I think we are investing in areas that are wealth creating, and I think you can see that from the very strong performance. I think the business confidence survey was up about 13%. I don't have I think I'll correct if that's wrong, but I'm sure it was about 13%. So there is a strong underlying base there within the Scottish economy. Are there issues? Yes, there certainly are, and we need to make sure the skills gap is addressed and that the skills match the needs of the economy. But there are some very strong performances underlying some of that. In terms of the college budgets, the budget delivers an uplift in resource funding available to the college and university sectors. I think for FE's seeing a 13 million uplift, HE also increasing by 13 million. The uplift to the college budget is resource, and I think the decrease in college capital, which, if you take the two together, is perhaps where the figure's coming from, reflects the profile of spend on significant campus investments that are essentially coming to an end. So you think about the Dunfermline campus, for example. So there's been a peak for college capital, but the resource budget is seeing a over 13 million uplift, which is a 2.1%. I think one of the things I would absolutely agree with is the need to better join up the work of SDS and the colleges, and to make sure that the offer from colleges and from Skills Development Scotland is actually meeting the needs of the economy and employers. And obviously the Withers review was very much in that space, about needing to be far more joined up, far more sharply focused, and of course that is the ambition of the government. So I'm happy to provide further information, Convener, if that would be helpful on some of the work that's going on in that space.
Yeah, I mean, time's marching on. And I've got loads of more questions to ask. I'm only going to ask a couple more questions to enable my colleagues to come in here, possibly three. But one is on universities. So, for example, a time when universities are struggling due to a reduction in overseas student numbers, the student support and tuition fee payment line is falling by 10.5%. Is the tuition fee payment stuck on $1,820 per student for the 18th consecutive year? And if so, how does that enable universities to be globally competitive? And just to add to that, in a submission to the committee, Professor Alistair Florence, Director of Continuous Manufacturing and Advanced Crystallisation at Strathclyde University, pointing to analysis by UK Research and Innovation that £63 is generated for the wider economy for every pound spent on such research. Now, even if that was out by a factor of 10, it would still be a huge return on investment. Should we therefore not direct the fairly modest resources needed to ensure the long-term growth of such facilities to places like Strathclyde, which, like other universities, seem to be under the cosh at the moment?
Well, first of all, let me recognise very much the role of universities, and I think one of the recommendations the committee had made around and I'm trying to remember what the name of it was, that it was like a kind of fund to turbocharge university output into enterprise. I think the committee had at one point called for $5 million to do that. As I understand, I think work is going on in the enterprise space to look at how that can be done and how we can support our universities with maybe better link-ups to enterprise and to SNIB, for example, to be able to do that. But there are, we should always also keep the level of tuition fee payment under review to make sure we are taking regard of some of the headwinds. But the main headwinds at the moment that the sector have spoken to me about are, first of all, the drop in international students, particularly from some areas of the world where there has been an absolute falling off a cliff of international students that were assumed by universities and are now no longer coming. And some of the UK government changes around not being able to bring partners over, etc., has had a major impact. The other is the ENICS issue, which is a major impact for universities. So,
I'll go on to that in a wee second, actually. But I'm just concerned about this 1,820 tuition fee. I mean, it seems to me nonsensical, like, in fact, the Minister's not taking a pay rise for 18 years, that it should remain the same for 18 years. I mean, how is that helping universities? And surely that means that incentivises universities not to take Scottish students if, in fact, they're getting that same amount, which declines by inflation year on year on year. That cannot be right, surely, and you say it's under review, but it doesn't seem, there's no evidence that it's actually changing.
Well, I think we absolutely must make sure that all of the component parts that make up the university funding and are, the bedrock of the sustainability of HE are looked at. The tuition fee issue is one, but the issue of international students, of research, of other costs, I think are unfortunately have all come along at the same time and are putting particular pressure on the university sector. We will continue to work with the university sector. The universities are not all in the same position either. Some have more resilience than others, and I think some current issues have shown that to be the case. So you make a fair point, convener, but it's there are other major issues impacting on the university sector.
I'm not going to have the time to touch on reform or transparency in capital spending. I'm not going to touch on enterprise either, although I would point out that the £1,334 million additional spend on welfare is exactly the same amount as the total budget allocated to the Deputy First Minister for Economy and Gaelic on page 78 of the budget. My last question is actually about national insurance. Now, the draft budget is written, I take it, does not take into account the £549 million cost of national insurance increases in the public sector and the £210 million impact on the third sector, independent care homes, and indeed £49 million for universities. Can I ask you how much the UK Government has confirmed at this point it will allocate to the Scottish Government to cover these costs, and how will they be dispersed?
So we've had no official confirmation from the Treasury. I'm waiting for a reply to my letter to essentially, to put, as I put forward the case, that essentially the full cost of covering public sector is over 500 million. The areas you mentioned, social care, universities, etc., will take it up to over 700 million. The figure that has been talked about in the public domain from sources is between 300 and I think 380. But at this moment in time, I'm not in a position to have had confirmed that we are only getting a particular figure, and therefore I'm still pursuing the Treasury on this point. When we do get to a kind of final position, and if it's only a Barnett share, I think that is not acceptable for all the reasons I've set out previously. It doesn't recognise the investment that we've made in the public sector, and I don't think we should be penalised for that. But once we get to a final figure, then I will want to ensure a fair allocation of that, because clearly we have not just the health service, police, fire, etc., SG itself, but we've got local government. Local government, their analysis was about 265. So you can see that there is a real issue there around the gap. What I have done, though, I think, is through the budget allocations to local government and to portfolios, there is a degree of resilience within those budgets. So that is helpful, but I can't underestimate the impact, because that will mean that if there's a shortfall of circa 300 million, then that is an opportunity cost that will have to be found that can't then be spent on other things within that portfolio. So the issue is far from resolved, and we have a live negotiation with the Treasury, and we've had no formal response to say this is it and the end of. So
65 million you touched on. I think they've said there'll be another 85 million on cost in terms of procurement, but but I'm not convinced they have the resilience that you've touched on. That certainly isn't the message I'm hearing from local authorities. But I'm going to open up the session to colleagues around the table. First will be Ross, to be followed by John.
Convener, good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to start off with the public health levy. So in 2024, the Scottish Government did some engagement exercises, consultation with stakeholders on that, with a view to considering whether it could be added to the non-domestic rates scheme. Obviously, that was before the UK Government's decision on employer national insurance contributions, which I presume has played a role in the Government's decision not to go ahead with that this year. Could you clarify, though, whether the Government believes there is a potential role for a public health levy as part of the NDR system in future years?
Well, I mean, there's something that is there as an option to going forward in the future if circumstances change. And as you pointed out, a lot of work has been done on the public health supplement. However, and you've set this out yourself, believe very strongly that this would not be the right time to introduce such a supplement because of the pressures from primarily the employers' national insurance contributions, which I think the Scottish retail sector have welcomed very much, the fact that that's been recognised now and that we're not going to go ahead with the supplement. It was mainly large retail operations that would have been affected, but nevertheless, given the on-costs of employers' national insurance contributions, we just came to the conclusion that this would not be the right time. I don't have a kind of crystal ball to look into the future of different circumstances, but that was essentially a decision for those reasons. And
so, just to clarify, timescale and context aside, given the consideration that took place last year, the Government recognises that there is potential value to that policy, and where the right circumstances come about, the right economic context, wider UK tax context, that there is the potential to introduce that in a recognition of its value.
Well, it shouldn't be ruled out forever and a day into the future. I mean, it's there as an option, but it would very much depend on the circumstances that you've laid out. But for the foreseeable future, I would say it's definitely not the right time.
Thanks. And turning to council tax, and before getting into the kind of wider conversation around that, on some of the interim steps the Government's taken, so it's very welcome that councils now have the ability to double council tax on second homes alongside the existing one for empty properties. But when that policy was announced, the Government also announced that it was going to explore moving beyond that. So in Wales, they can levy 300% council tax on second and empty homes. The consultation on that in Scotland took place in spring of 2023 and showed very strong support for empowering councils here to have a similar option as Wales. But that would require primary legislation. Is it the Scottish Government's intention to bring that legislation forward in the remainder of this Parliament? And if so, what's the legislative vehicle for it? Because I'm not aware of an obvious one, but there are a couple of potentials that I could see it being within scope for.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a lot of sympathy for the principle of it, given we're trying to avoid the loss of second homes, and particularly in rural Scotland, it still remains an issue despite the action that's been taken. I think my starting point here is to empower local government to make these decisions, and we're looking at the moment a consultation on general power of competence, and we've taken measures that you're well aware of to strengthen the fiscal levers that local government has. I will need to come back to you about whether or not there is time within this session left, given the need for primary legislation, as you have set out, in order to go beyond the second home levy that is already in place. And I would need to come back because I don't think it's planned for, but I will come back and confirm one way.
If you could write to the committee about that, that'd be useful, because that was a commitment from some time ago, and I recognise the challenges with the legislative timescale. On that wider point around reform of local government finances and the council tax specifically, the committee made a recommendation in our pre-budget scrutiny report based on comments that you had made to us previously around your perception, the government's perception, that it's very difficult to make progress on substantive council tax reform without a cross-party consensus. That was an entirely fair and legitimate point, but the committee in our report then put it back to the government to say, well, what steps are you taking to create the space in which that can actually emerge? I was quite disappointed by the government's response to that particular recommendation in the committee report, because it included no further action, just a recap essentially of what the joint working group local government has already done in the past. Could you just clarify what is your expectation or desire for May 2026 on council tax reform? What does the government want to achieve in the remainder of this session?
So, well, I'm sorry that you feel like that about the response, because actually I think it's very important to try and create some level of cross-party agreement on principles. It may not be on the detail, but on principles, because I think doing nothing going forward is not an option. Katie Hagman from COSLA has been leading on that, and as I understand, she's been having cross-party meetings from a COSLA perspective that will help to scope out where there may be a landing space of agreement. And I would be keen over the course of between now and the beginning of next year, in advance of the 2026 election, to try to set out where there may be cross-party agreement to allow then action to be taken by whatever administration after May next year to do some further more fundamental reform of the council tax. Now, in the run-up to an election, that is maybe more difficult, but I think we would all agree that there are inherent unfairness within the council tax, that it is very limited in its scope. So if we were to agree some principles, it might then pave the way for more detailed discussions around, well, what are the reforms that could command a majority within Parliament. There's no point going down an avenue that is never going to command a majority in Parliament. That's just going to be a waste of everyone's time. But I do think that there will be principles that we can agree on. So Katie's been leading on that, Katie Hagman, and she has the government's support in doing that. And I'm, once after the budget is concluded, would be keen to engage directly myself with some of those discussions, building on the work that she's done.
Welcome clarification. I don't mean this as a criticism of Councillor Hagman at all, but having met with her in COSA on a number of occasions recently and discussing issues around this, I wasn't aware that she, on behalf of the Joint Working Group, was trying to identify points of potential agreement between the parties on this. I think that is useful clarification, given most party finance spokesperson are in this room, that is one of the purposes of discussions there, and that feeds back up to the Joint Working Group. Given that, though, and what you were saying around the lead up to the election, just for absolute clarity, it is not your expectation that any substantial reform will take place ahead of the election. There will be potential reforms around the edge, what we've just mentioned around second and empty homes, etc. But questions that have been raised before around things like revaluation, it sounds like what you're saying is that there is not going to be progress or even agreement on any of that this side of the election.
Well, it's hard to see how there could be progress this side of the election, but if there were agreement around some principles that could work their way into manifestos, for example, that are areas where there's a bit more consensus on reform, then I think that would be a good thing to kind of break through some of the inertia and the lack of agreement. But there's not the practicalities of driving that forward beyond the work that's already in train that you've mentioned earlier on. There's just not going to be the time for that. So it really is about just trying to see whether there is scope for some cross-party consensus around some change that could then hit the ground running at the early part of the session next term.
Thanks, that was useful. There's one point of clarification that I would find useful from something that the First Minister said last week. It was in the context of an exchange that was about income tax, but he was quite firm in saying that there will be no further tax changes this side of the election. Was he specifically referring to income tax there, or was that a wider statement around all devolved taxes, i.e. if there is potential tweaks to the council tax that are identified that have cross-party agreement around potentially the going further on second and empty homes, is the government's position that that will not take place this side of the election either, or was he just referring to income tax there?
Referring to income tax in terms of rates and bands, and to give certainty. I think that's yeah.
Small business bonus scheme, an issue that I've raised with you before. At present, shooting estates benefit from small business bonus scheme tax breaks. Now, in the grand scheme of a £250 million tax break programme, it's only somewhere between 3 and 5 million that goes to shooting estates. It's certainly my view that they are not the intended recipients of that. We've discussed in the past the issues around disaggregating the data, separating shooting estates from crofts, essentially. Is the Scottish Government still intent on finding a solution to that? And does the Government believe that shooting estates should be excluded from the small business bonus scheme if an issue with the data disaggregation can be resolved?
So I'm aware work has been looked at. I don't know, Ellen, are you able to?
It's a matter for Scottish assessors as independent from government about how they assess different parcels of land, different types of property. It's a conversation that takes place, but the data isn't there. I mean, I want to respond on the matter of the government's policy, Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah. I mean, I've got sympathy for the principle of it. I think where we were concerned was unintended consequences of crofts, for example, being captured by some of that. So it would need to be really carefully done. And I think the data issue still remains problematic. What I'm happy to do, Ross, is just to perhaps come back to you with a bit of an update of where we've got with all of that, if that'd be helpful.
That'd be useful, thanks. And then just finally, alongside the draft budget, the Government published a memorandum on borrowing policy that included a section on the first phase of due diligence around the issuing of Scottish Government bonds. What's included there is essentially a list of conclusions rather than any detail on what that first phase of due diligence threw up. Is there any more detailed documentation on that in the public domain already? Because I wasn't able to find it. And if not, could the details of that first phase of due diligence be published? Because what's in the borrowing memorandum document is very high level. It's certainly my view that where the Scottish Government's move ahead with issuing bonds, that would be a really significant step and one that would require significant parliamentary scrutiny. There's not really enough on the public record at the moment to begin effective scrutiny. And I recognise it's only the first phase of due diligence, but I still think that what's there isn't really sufficient for transparency.
Well, okay, I take your point. I mean, we... alongside the budget on the 4th of December, we published a memorandum detailing borrowing policy and guidelines, and that included the update on the progress towards a future Scottish Government bond issuance. And I know you're saying it's quite high level. So that initial phase of due diligence has been completed, there are, I guess, a number of considerations which we need to take into consideration. So there are market conditions, for example, which are very topical at the moment, which have to be taken into account as well. There has to be a compelling value for money case made. So the next stage of the due diligence work will consider all of that in more detail, and I'll update Parliament over the course of the financial year. But we would only proceed with caution, taking into account all of the issues, and current circumstances are one of those issues that would be part of that due diligence work. I don't know, Jenny, if you want to add in.
Thanks, Club Sec. I thought perhaps helpful just to say would take away that comment and reflection and can give consideration to what will be published at the end of the next phase of due diligence, which we've signalled will take place next. So we've completed that first initial phase, next phase, and we'll consider what can be put into the public domain at the end of that phase.
That'd be helpful, Jenny. Thank you. Thanks, Convener. That's everything from me.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. Maybe I can build to start with on some of the things that have been said already. I mean, you've said that the indication is income tax won't really change or be increased between now and the election, and neither will council tax be radically changed. But does that not leave us with a problem that we just do not have enough tax income for the services we want to provide? And we look at countries like Denmark, which have much higher taxes as a proportion of GDP. Do we not need to be looking at raising taxes somehow?
So one of the things the tax strategy pointed towards was to look at, not in the short term, but to look at whether or not there was scope within powers, or to get additional powers through agreement with the UK Government around wealth taxes, for example, and also to work with the Land Commission around the issue of land, which I know has been an issue of interest to this committee previously, which could include the carbon land tax interest. But that's not going to happen short term. It's not going to happen to raise revenues within this session of Parliament. I mean, the tax revenues, as I highlighted earlier on, are actually very strong. The issue for us, though, is the complexities of fiscal framework in relation to the rest of the UK in terms of net gain, and also I guess some of the constraints around things we might want to do around migration, for example, in terms of boosting the economy. What I did set out earlier on was some of the other levers that we're looking at around fiscal sustainability, and I set out 7 areas that we're exploring in order to be able to contain cost and to prioritise within the funding that we do have. And that will be set out in more detail in the fiscal sustainability plan alongside the medium-term financial strategy in the spring. And I think that's in recognition that we have to make sure that whether it's on workforce, whether it's on reform, whether it's on prioritisation of frontline services, looking at our public sector landscape, looking at the support backroom functions, all of which offer up opportunities to make sure that the resources we do have are being spent in the priorities that we would want, and to create the headroom going forward to make sure that can be done.
Okay. So, I realise some of this is longer term, but I mean, you mentioned just now the fiscal framework, and the convener earlier on mentioned the economic performance gap. Now, you'd said under the previous government that Westminster was just not on the table to renegotiate the fiscal framework. Has there been any change in attitude from Westminster on that regard? Because, I mean, I feel that we're competing with London in the South East, which is incredibly difficult. The Barnett formula is squeezing us as well. I just feel in the long term we're in a bad trajectory unless we can get the whole fiscal framework reorganised.
Well, you know my ambition around the fiscal framework, and we've been very limited previously around the scope of change, albeit we've got some adjustments. And, you know, we absolutely want to have a more ambitious review of the fiscal framework. I'm not, despite communication being better with Treasury, I'm not getting a sense from them that they are as keen to have a more fundamental look at the fiscal framework. We will keep pursuing that issue, and you know, whether it's on that or whether it's on migration policy and many of the other levers that are going to be really, really important to the Scottish economy, you know, we will continue to pursue these issues, but it requires it requires them to want to face in the same direction on these issues, and so far that has not been forthcoming.
Okay, that doesn't sound wildly optimistic, but fair enough. That's okay. Now, we already had mention of the two-child limit and the Scottish Child Payment. Can you clarify for me, maybe I missed this already, but it would seem simpler to just increase the Scottish Child Payment. There's not a lot of bureaucracy in that. We don't need Westminster's permission. Whereas with the two-child limit, we kind of need to set up a new system. We need to get Westminster to agree to give us information, as I understand it. Why not just go for the Scottish Child Payment and make it higher?
So we looked at a number of options, which is, you know, when we were deciding on the best way to proceed to do more to tackle child poverty, and we felt we needed to do more, particularly given the statutory child poverty targets. I mean, partly, I think there is an issue that the convener touched on earlier on about cliff edges of, you know, if there is a balance of the Scottish Child Payment and whether or not it then becomes a cliff edge and a barrier to work, incentivisation. So we were quite thoughtful of that. We understand from, you know, the information we have about the families most impacted by the two-child cap are the poorest families, and by targeting them, we're going to make a bigger shift on the dial on child poverty than a more general approach. So these are judgments, and we looked, I can assure you, in some detail around what is the best thing to lean into to have the biggest impact. And the child poverty organisations were also very much in the same space. They, not all, some still argue for an increase to Scottish Child Payment, but many have focused on this because it is some of the poorest families who we think could, it can make the biggest shift in the dial on the targets.
And is Westminster being cooperative on this point?
So, broadly, yes. I mean, the devil will be in the detail, but Shirley-Anne Somerville has been in communication with the Department of Work and Pensions and with Liz Kendall directly, and I understand that the mood music has been quite positive. There are quite a lot of technicalities to work through, so not just the data, but if you remember, whether you remember, I don't know, but the Scottish Child Payment, one of the things that had to be negotiated and addressed was ensuring disregard for income, because otherwise, essentially, if you don't have a disregard for the mitigating the two-child cap, then there's going to be no gain for the family. So that disregard will have to be agreed. So data, agreement on disregard, there'll then require to be legislation, and then there needs to be the system set up. So, but to answer your question, communication is good, and there seems to be a willingness to work with us on that.
Okay, well, that's positive. Thank you. I'm sure we'll get updates in due course. On pay policy, I think we're very pleased, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission is very pleased to have a clear pay policy this year, which I think is approximately 3%. Now, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, in their forecasts, have added 1.5% to that for wages, which I think is to cover like pay progression and so on. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, it will be different for different organisations, and one of the reasons pay progression has never been part of pay policy is for that reason, that different organisations will be in an entirely different position with regard to pay progression. So the health service is in a very different position from other parts of the public sector, and the value of that pay progression is markedly different from one body to another. So pay progression has never been recognised as part of pay policy, and it's always been assumed that public bodies and public organisations will absorb the cost of pay progression themselves within their budgets, and those will be different for each organisation. So it's never been calculated as part of pay policy. It's not that I don't recognise it's there, but it will be very different from one organisation to another.
Some organisations might mean they need to trim their total numbers of staff in order to keep within
at
policy.
the end of the day, the envelope, the 9% over 3 years was to give some scope and latitude for that, the configuration of that in a way that meets the needs of the organisation that they can afford. So it has to be affordable, and they have to be able to deliver it within the allocations that they have been given. So whatever decisions are made around the specifics on pay for each organisation, clearly efficiencies, headcount, reform, doing things differently are all part of the way that organisations are expected to manage their pay bills.
And are you optimistic you can hold this 3% or 9% over 3 years line in the face of, there could be pressure? We don't want rubbish piling up in the streets, so bin collection staff have quite a lot of power. Colleges in the past, we had to put extra money in as well. Do you think this 3% and 9% can be held? Well,
it is above inflation, and I would hope there's a recognition of that. But I think also for many of the negotiations that I've been involved in over the years, the actual number in terms of pay policy is one part of the equation. A lot of the time it's part of a package of reforms, doing things differently, other benefits, non-pay benefits. So, for the civil service, for example, the configuration of the working week was of most importance, and it has a value. For other parts of the public sector, there will be different priorities at different times. I guess in the run-up to an election year, it can sometimes bring its own kind of flavour. But our pay policy is slightly higher. The UK government have landed on like 2.8%, and so it will remain to be seen, I guess, what the pay review bodies come up with. That was very much a driver last year, and I would hope that they will have taken cognizance of some of the evidence that's been given around progress to date. And actually, when you look at Scottish pay rates by comparison, there's been a quite there is Scottish pay rates on balance and average are in excess of those in the rest of the UK, and I would hope that that starting point and the investment that's already been made would be recognised by the staff side and unions.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. Michael, to be followed by Craig.
Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. A few quick points of clarification first on your previous answers, if that's okay. The first one, an earlier answer to Ross Greer, you talked about saying that the income tax policies were going to be essentially frozen between now and the election. Does that include the thresholds for the intermediate rates, so relating to fiscal drag? So are we going to see those rates frozen again, or will they be uprated?
So I think in the tax strategy, Lorraine, we have said that they'll be frozen for the duration of
So we said
this
that
Parliament.
the higher advance and top rates of tax will be frozen for the remainder of the parliamentary term, and we're committed to above inflation increases for the starting basic, which has an impact on the intermediate rate because of the way they interact with other two bands.
So you're anticipating that will that figure then change, or won't it? So we'll see more fiscal drag, or will that go? Because I understand a bit about the top rates and the bottom rates. It's those medium rates where the bulk of the tax increase revenue comes from.
Well, I mean, if we were to do the same with above inflationary increases to the lower rates, then that will impact on the intermediate rate in a positive way, rather than...
Maybe you could set that out.
I'll come back and set it out.
I appreciate it. On the fiscal sustainability delivery plan, so we've heard taken evidence about the general approach to public service reform. Are we expecting that to cover public service reform beyond back office functions? Because I think a lot of the work that we've taken evidence on from Ivan McKee, your colleague, has been about property, it's been about realising savings and back office functions. Are we expecting it to focus on just that, or is there going to be a broader approach to actually the longer term delivery of public services and the shape of those services?
Yeah, I mean, I'll set out as much detail as we're able to at that stage. So, for example, if you think about the use of AI and digital, I think offers huge opportunities, and I want to say something about that in the plan. There's already work going on around the use of digital, so in the NHS, the digital front door, starting NHS Lanarkshire, the use of digital within some of our capabilities of our public bodies has already saved the requirement for massive recruitment exercises, for example, by smart use of digital. I will set out as much detail as I can at that point.
And on the last set of questions regarding the options around the two-child cap and the mitigation of that, so it's my understanding that if the model that you set out to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, which they've costed, that there's a very significant cliff edge in that if you move past qualification for universal credit, a family's income could drop by £1,000 a month for earning £1 more than, say, 13,000. So could you perhaps write back to the committee with the options appraisal that you set out in terms of why you chose this option in preference to some of the others that you set out? Just a commitment to that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you. So moving on, in your budget statement, when you set out the draft budget, you said, and I quote, "We'll increase total investment in higher education by 3.5%. Is that the case?
If that's what I said, then that should be the case. I can feel there's a but coming, though. So
yeah, there's a but. There's a but. Okay, let's have the
but.
but. Okay, so the University of Scotland are saying that the higher education is actually facing a 0.7% real terms cut to their funding, and they're struggling to see where that 3.5% figure comes from. Perhaps it might be that you have combined a 12.97 million increase in cash with also repurposing money that was already in the system. So there was a £14.5 million amount of money that was a hangover from the COVID situation and the bubble. Is that the figure and how you've come to that 3.5?
I will come back to you about that, because unless someone has the answer to that, Richard, no. And I want to be correct, so I will come back with the detail on that.
I appreciate that, because I think it does come to the convener's point around essentially the no increase in that amount of student resource for many years. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that's resulted in a 22% real terms reduction in the amount of funding available to our universities. I was at the Education Committee last week to ask questions about the situation at the University of Dundee, which you'll be very familiar with. And the Minister for Higher Education refused to recognise that figure. Is it a figure that you recognise, a 22% real terms reduction?
No, it's not a figure I recognise, but I will cover that issue in the reply I give to you about to the committee about the figures in terms of the increase. I'll cover that point as well. I mean, I guess I don't want to get into the details about Dundee, but I think I don't think Dundee is representative of some of the issues in the wider sector. I'm not saying there's not issues in the wider sector, but there are particular issues relating to Dundee that I think are slightly over here, without getting into all of the detail, but you'll know all of those issues as well as I do. But I will come back. I don't recognise the figure, but I will cover that point in the letter back to the committee.
I appreciate that, and if you can look at the working on it, it's a pretty simple figure, I'm afraid. So it's taken the amount of inflation over the recent period and setting it against the cash allocation. And it seems to me, in my looking at it, to be entirely robust. I mean, so that, and you described it earlier on, I take your point about the Dundee situation. There's been real failures in terms of management, in terms of the leadership in different ways. But you just said that the main headwinds were not about Scottish Government funding, as in your answer to convener. I mean, I would contend that with a 22% real terms reduction, that just simply isn't the case.
So when you refer to inflation, what period are you talking about in terms of uplift?
So the 22%, I think, is across, I think, the last 5 years, right. And half of that inflation, the 22% real terms reduction, has been across the last 2 years. It's my understanding in terms of the allocations that you've made.
So, I mean, the only point I would make is that when you think about the constraints of budgets before the reset of budgets, then the public sector per se, including our institutions or universities, were all constrained by the fact that we were not able to. The Scottish Government's budgets were constrained and were not keeping pace with inflation. That was the whole point of the reset of the budgets that the Chancellor made, was to recognise that. So that's the only point I would make in the general sense that, if we're including within that figure, the lack of ability to keep pace with inflation, well, you could say that across a whole range of services because the money just simply wasn't there. Our budgets weren't kept pace with inflation, which is why the reset has been so important and welcome, I have to say. But if your point is, well, are the universities getting a fair share of the reset? Well, I'll come back to the committee on that point because I think that's a question that I'm absolutely happy to answer.
I suppose it does come to my issue about the health of the sector, though, and Dundee being part of that equation. But if you look at Robert Gordon University, Aberdeen University, Edinburgh University, St Andrews University, University of the West of Scotland, headlines across the sector in recent days, and the leaders of the universities are clear that the underlying issue is this 22% real terms reduction from the Scottish Government, because that enforces the business model, which means that they are exposed to the fluctuations in international recruitment. So I suppose in the longer term, so short term, we talk about 12 million, 14 million, these are small numbers in comparison to the size of that overall budget. But in the longer term, what's your vision of how we get a sustainable sector that can actually pay for itself?
Well, and I'm not going to try and dodge the question you're putting directly to me, and I will take it away and make sure that the part the Scottish Government can play is a positive one in recognising, because the point being made, it was by the convener about the value, economic value of the university sector is a real one. So I will take that away and come back. On the point about financial sustainability of our public services, including our universities, is absolutely critical. Now, they're all different in terms of what the issues are and what their underlying resilience is and where the headwinds come from. So the universities will be impacted, particularly on the international students issue. I think that has to be resolved. I don't think it can stand, and I really hope. I think the inclination of the UK government coming in afresh is to want to relook at that, but I think they are concerned probably about the whole debate around migration, immigration numbers.
International figures, so I take your point, that's been a very significant issue, but the most recent decrease in international recruitment is partly about 2 devaluations in the Nigerian currency. There's nothing the UK government can do about that. There is something that this government can do about exposure of our universities to a volatile international recruitment situation.
Don't accept there's nothing the UK government can do around, for example, the
Nigerian currency.
No, but the partners of of students coming to study
Yeah,
and to all of that is important. It has put people off, without a doubt, and they've gone elsewhere. The ENICS issue, the UK government can certainly do something about that. I'm not trying to dodge responsibility. I'm just saying that there are a number of headwinds here. I accept that the Scottish Government's funding is a key part of the sustainability of the university sector, but so is, the research capability of being able to attract that. So is, the issue of employers' national insurance contribution. So is the issue of international students. What I'm really keen to do is to engage with the UK government around how, and I know that there's a particular issues for Scottish and Northern English universities about being able to attract the number of international students that perhaps gravitate elsewhere. Yeah. So I will look at the issue that you've raised, and I will come back with a fulsome response. Okay. And I'm very open to looking going forward about what more can we do that within the confines of the resources available to us, because there are issues not just for universities that. But we have to play our part in making sure that there's sustainability of the sector going forward.
And as highlighted already, incredibly important to growth in the economy. On the colleges side, but the Chief Executive College of Scotland said that the budget fails to recognise the vital role that colleges play in driving economic growth, and the Scottish Government's continued disinvestment in such a cornerstone of the education and skills sector is deeply troubling. I mean, this is really about short-term little harm, some people might say, in this budget. But longer term, this is about whether we are disinvesting in our future as a country. I mean, is that not a trajectory that troubles you in terms of the shape of the budget?
I mean, I wouldn't describe it or recognise it in those terms. Are there challenges for the college sector? I think it's challenge that every sector has its challenges. I think the big challenge we have is the point that we touched on earlier on, is around the joining up of our skills landscape in a way that delivers better for employers and for the economy. Now, if you look, for example, at some of the colleges that have really got ahead and reformed and made the changes that they need to make, Dundee and Angus College is a great example of that. And it has made decisions to invest in some areas, to disinvest in others, to really try to anticipate some of the headwinds that have over the last few years, where budgets were particularly constrained, and they are in a pretty resilient and forward-looking position. Is that the same across the whole college estate? I think their colleges are in different positions across the country, but it does show it can be done, and that's down to local leadership and vision, and a real joining up of the skills landscape with others across the city. So we absolutely, and I very much recognise, having had a daughter that's gone through the college system, returning to education after leaving school at 16, much to my pain at the time, but the college system has been an amazing opportunity for people of all walks of life. So I'm very, very aware of its value. Is there more we can do? If there is, I want to do that, but it's part about joining the dots of the skills system. That has to be done.
I'll close with remaining in Dundee, unsurprisingly, regarding PEF money. Mm-hmm. So the Cabinet Secretary last week told the Education Committee that the PEF funding stream has become absolutely essential to the way in which schools are now run. There's yet another very significant reduction in PEF money in Dundee, and that's going to result in 18.8 full-time equivalent teacher reduction in our schools. That's meant to be for the most vulnerable young people. Are you disappointed by the way that SNP colleagues in Dundee are running this situation?
Well, I think colleagues in various councils are doing their best to deliver services of the highest quality they can for their citizens. What we have agreed with COSLA around teachers, because I know the Cabinet Secretary for Education wanted to make sure we had stability in teacher numbers, was that the funding uplift of the 145 plus the additional money for additional support needs was going to enable a stabilisation of teaching figures at 2023 levels. So some councils are beyond that already. Other councils, if they're below that, will require to make the investment to bring it up to those standards. And so I'm not going to focus on one particular council's issue. I will look at it, but I'm not. You're giving me quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, I think you have there. But I mean, this budget was cut by half by your government for Dundee, the PEF money. They're redistributed to other parts of the country. And next Monday night, SNP councillors are bringing forward a proposal to remove 18.8 full-time equivalent posts from the most vulnerable children in Dundee. Should they withdraw the proposals?
So you'll be aware of any distribution formulas that change are from COSLA, which is 32 local authorities that decide what the distribution formulas are. We don't arbitrarily change distribution formulas that are going to, change the way that...
It was agreed with the government, though, Cabinet Secretary, to change the way that the PEF money was distributed across the country, from focusing on areas of the highest deprivation to spreading it more widely.
That was COSLA.
But with the government in agreement.
Well, COSLA made this decision. So, if you're asking me, should 32 local authorities of various political colours, I may add, come to a decision that the government doesn't like, should we overrule that?
Well,
I think that might be quite controversial.
I'm asking you whether the SNP council should withdraw these proposals on
Monday. I think all councils, because I could cite to you a number of decisions that Labour councils have made that I don't find particularly appetising, and I'm sure you would not want to criticise the performance of those councils. So, I'm not going to pick out a particular council's decision-making because they will have made a range of decisions, some which you or I will agree with and some which we might. You could say that about 32 local authorities. The point I'm making, though, is that any changes to funding formulas, much to my frustration sometimes, are about 32 local authorities making decisions about how the funding should be provided. The only decision I have made is around the funding floor, and that takes account of census data, which I can't ignore, around shifts in population, and that is one of the areas that I make decisions of, apart from the overall local government settlement. But anything about distribution formulas, I'm afraid, comes down to the vagaries of how COSLA make their decisions, and that, I'm afraid, is an area that, if I was to step into and say, oh, I don't like the decision you've made on that distribution formula because it doesn't, it doesn't benefit this council or that council, then I think I would probably get short shrift, not just from COSLA, but I can imagine there'll be questions on the floor of the chamber about it as well. So these things have to be looked at in the round.
Followed by Liz. Mr. Speaking to the BBC last week, the First Minister described independence as an urgent priority. Can you point to me where in the budget there is any expenditure for preparations for independence in the forthcoming year?
Well, first of all, the First Minister is quite right to say that, because we have never shied away from it being our key objective, that we think the constitutional arrangements of the country will be better served by decisions being made by the people who live and work here in Scotland. I don't think that's a contentious thing. In terms of the budget, the priority of the funding is set out in the budget. That is all of the priorities that I have outlined in Parliament, the frontline services and so on and so forth. The money that was contained alongside the publication of the Bands papers, the Building a New Scotland series, were actually civil servants who were working within Angus Robertson's team. So it was always a bit of a, and they do many other things as well. This is civil servants who work on a number of other objectives, and they happen to produce the Band series. There are some conclusions around the culmination of those Band series and the production thereafter, but it is not a line within the budget that says spend on independence. So,
Are you intending to spend any taxpayers' money or any civil service time in this budget year on preparations for independence?
Not beyond what's already. I've just outlined that the band series, I think, is coming to a natural end, and I think there was going to be a kind of publication of that thereafter. Is there a line in the budget or intention to do something new in that space? There's nothing in this budget that would indicate that beyond the spend that I've already indicated around some of the civil service time within Angus Robertson's team. And that is really how it's been for quite some time.
So if there was a dedicated unit, they will be redeployed elsewhere, those civil servants?
Well, I've just told you that the civil servants that work in Angus Robertson's team also have a number of other responsibilities. So we're not disbanding anybody. I'm just saying that it's a small team who do a number of other things as well. One of the things they've done is produce the band series, and there's some further concluding work to be done around that, as I understand. If you want further detail on that, I'll get something from Angus Robertson to give you the detail.
The convener obviously talked, when he opened, about in-year budget reallocations and transfers. At this point in time, what are the Scottish Government's current anticipated in-year transfers between portfolios in 2025 and 2026? Do you have any notion as to what the size of those in-year transfers might be?
The overall size of the in-year transfers, mainly to local governments. Have you got?
Yeah, for local government, the anticipated size is set out in table 4.12 at the moment. So our anticipated range at the moment of in-year transfers in 25-26 is just over 1.4 billion. So that's set out in the budget in table 4.12.
Okay, so Minister, just in terms of those who might be a little bit cynical about the way in which these figures are being presented, can you give some assurance that this is not being sort of done deceptively to artificially increase the health and social care figure at the start of the tax year to fit a political narrative, whilst we already know that a significant in-year transfer will take place, particularly towards local government? What's the reason for it starting in one pot and ending up in another?
Well, because some of the areas, the policy very clearly sits within the policy area that the money is allocated to, but the delivery will be through local government. So, there's a list here where a number of areas are areas with the policy decision, so free school meals, mental health, support, where the policy around free school meals will sit with education, the policy around direction of mental health sits within health, but the delivery is by local government. We wouldn't want local government necessarily 32 local authorities to decide what the policy around mental health interventions is, because the expertise sits within health. Likewise, with free school meals, what is being delivered in terms of the structure, the costings, the requirements, the policy sat within education, and local government in partnership were agreed to deliver it. So, I mean, I've got a whole list where I could go through and, rehearse that.
More to do with the principle, Minister, in the sense that it does make it more difficult for independent analysts and for Parliament to look at your budget's presenting priorities when it continues to change throughout the course of the year.
Okay, well, page 40 sets out the list. Yeah. It's there, it's transparent.
To make year-on-year comparisons is quite tricky. You would concede that point. We
have reduced massively, we've massively increased, actually, the baselining of funding. So to local government, a lot of it's been baselined. We've made some significant changes around portfolios, but there are just some. The one I mentioned earlier on around nursing education. So it's health that decide how many nurses, in terms of student nurses, we're going to have, and then that money is passed to education to deliver. So we've got to make sure the policy, the money sits in the right area initially for the policy, because that will determine how many nursing students, how much, then delivery to education. So we can try to do this as far as we can, but there are good reasons for in-year transfers that actually do make a lot of sense. But we've tried to be transparent by setting it out. Are there further things to reflect upon? I think I said to the convener at the start, if there's more we can do in that space, then we will. But there are sometimes some good reasons for the in-year transfer.
Okay, time's quite tight. So looking to tax, you chose to increase the basic and intermediate thresholds. Why did you choose not to do so for the higher rate tax thresholds?
Well, similar to the UK government, previous Tory administration and now Labour, they haven't. They've frozen the thresholds for higher rates as well. I think to 28 to 29. Lorraine, is that right? And essentially, to do anything else would have not been affordable, is the honest answer. So we've done what we have done to the limits of affordability to recognise those at the lower rates of tax, and between the action we've taken on supporting those on lower rates of tax alongside Social Security have, I think, is worth about £400 a year to those who are lower paid. To begin to unfreeze the thresholds at a higher rate would have not left money for investments in health or education or in the winter fuel payment and so on and so forth. These are choices that have to be made.
And Ivan McKee said that any further tax increases on income tax would be counterproductive in Scotland. Do you agree with him? And in what form would that counterproductiveness be highlighted?
We've decided not to make any further changes to rates and bands to give stability to taxpayers. We recognise that the tax base and the tax take in Scotland has been very, very important to enable us to fund many of the things that we are funding in terms of the delivery of public services. The 1.7 billion that we wouldn't have if we'd made similar tax decisions to the rest of the UK. But we know that you can only go so far at a time where household budgets are still under some constraint. So we made the decision that for the rest of this parliamentary term, what was most important in the light of all of that was some stability and certainty, and the tax strategy set that out with the commitment of no changes in rates and bands.
Okay, turning to business taxation, the Scottish Retail Consortium is critical in its submission of what you've described as the prospect that councils have been given more revenue-generating powers and wealth taxation, and that says that this is somewhat ominous. For clarity, can you give some kind of indication of what those additional revenue-generating powers might be, and also what would a wealth taxation be?
Well, of course, the Scottish Retail Consortium also said that there is much that retailers can get behind in the budget, and they call for people to support it. Well, I know, so can I. But so I think these things are absolutely a balance. So we want to make sure through the support we do give to retail, and that is considerable through the small business bonus scheme, through having a lower poundage, through the work we're doing on retail crime, and so on and so forth, that we are not proceeding with the public health supplement, all of which has been welcomed by the retail sector, that we are supporting as far as we can within the resources that we have. In terms of any further powers for local government, then of course, as part of the consultation on any of those, we would expect to hear from the business sector, from retail, where that is an issue, and we would take those decisions in the round. But I feel that that the response from the Retail Consortium, I think, is quite pragmatic. I think they recognise that the big concern they had around public health supplement at the wrong time, and us not proceeding with that has shown that we've listened, and that's a good thing.
One area where you haven't listened is in relation to hospitality, and you and I have discussed at quite some length the policy you've adopted on rates relief. This year you've maintained 100% relief for hospitality businesses in island and remote areas, but passed only 40% on to those hospitality businesses with a rateable value of below 51,000. So I suppose a question in two parts, Cabinet Secretary. Why does a remote pub qualify for 100% rates relief, when a rural pub who may be experiencing exactly the same challenges qualifies for only 40%? And why is a pub with a rateable value of £50,000 different to a pub with a rateable value, let's say, of £70,000? Because hasn't this whole policy and this support mechanism become intensely arbitrary?
No, it's a policy that supports 92% at least, I think, of premises. So the vast bulk will be able to benefit from one of those policies. And I guess the reason that I was persuaded to support hospitality in this way was, I think out of all sectors, they're still recovering from COVID. I think Brexit has had a major impact, particularly for those establishments that are, for example, on island communities. The cost of food and transport, inflation, impact on overheads, particularly felt by island hospitality businesses. And hospitality businesses can very much be at the heart of some of our communities in the islands, and indeed at the point you've made in terms of rural communities as well. And therefore, that is why we have decided to support and deliver the policy in the way we have. The basic rate point, it captures the vast majority of your local pub and your local restaurant, but it excludes some of the very large premises and chains that I think have a resilience that perhaps those smaller businesses have not. But it captures 92% of hospitality premises. And it's not just pubs and cafes and restaurants, it's B&Bs as well. So I think it's a balanced, in the light of having competing priorities, having to make sure that we've got a balanced budget that is fair. I think we've done what we can within to support as many hospitality premises as we can, but in a way that's affordable. And going further would have meant we couldn't spend money on, for example, winter fuel payments. So it's a balance.
Okay, thank you. I have one very, very final quick question. It's almost a play your cards right question. I have some questions in relation to public sector workforce, but at the end of 2025-2026, would you anticipate the core civil service workforce to be larger or smaller than it is at the beginning of the year?
Well, our aim through our recruitment controls is to reduce the civil service workforce, so we're working hard to do that. We started with the contingent workforce, so the temporary workforce, and we've reduced that by about 40%. So we have got some extended enhanced recruitment controls in place in order to try to contain and to reduce the size. I don't have a figure, but the trajectory I would hope would be, I expect to be on a downward trajectory.
Thank you. Followed by Michelle.
Thank you. I turn attention, please, to the question of social security budgets. When it comes to the child disability budget, at the moment is 450 million, and the costs are to go up to 618 million for 25-26. That's an increase of 37%. Could you outline why there is such an extensive increase in that part of the budget?
So again, I can do that at a high level, but we can perhaps come back with some further evidence from Social Security colleagues. But I think the system, which was supported by all parties, was designed to be fairer and easier to access and more humane, I think, and that perhaps in turn has encouraged rather than discouraged families to apply for child disability payment. There's then also just an issue around the relative levels of disability, and I'll correct this if I'm wrong, but I think there are there's probably something about population level of slightly higher rates for all of the reasons, perhaps more on the adult disability side.
Well, with respect, Cabinet Secretary, the increase for the adult disability payment is 11%, and the child disability increase is 37%, which is far in excess of the 11%, and also it's far in excess of what has happened south of the border. And what I'm interested in is why that has happened, because you know that's over the course of just a year, and that's a huge growth in payment. And what the reason for that is.
Well, I will need to come back to you with some detail from Social Security colleagues, but I suspect that at the heart of it is probably that it's a system that families feel more encouraged to access rather than discouraged not to access.
But would that, in relation to the adult disability, would that not be the same principle? Because the Scottish Government's been clear that the same principles are supposed to apply for both the disability benefits. That wouldn't explain the huge difference between 11% and 37%.
So I think probably I should come back to you with some detail around that, because I think I want to provide more detail than I'm able to.
It would be helpful, Cabinet Secretary, because I think one of the most important things that I think we have to try to do is to ensure that when welfare benefits are made, we have to try to measure the effectiveness of it. And I think there's relatively good cross-party support that the Scottish Child Payment has worked well. It's been quick, it's been easily accessed, and its record on targeting those most in need has generally been pretty convincing. I would argue that the evidence for that is much more positive than perhaps for other benefits. And if we're in a very tight fiscal situation, which we are, and obviously you've referred to that, we have to be sure that the benefits that are being paid out are effective. And yet we seem to have a considerable gap in the data to understand which payments are the most effective. Why is it that we know that the Scottish Child Payment has worked well when it's not so clear with some of these other benefits? And I think that's, would you accept that that's a really big issue for the Scottish Government, particularly if you're trying at the same time to mitigate policies from the Westminster Government?
So the child disability payment, of course, will be in much smaller numbers than adult disability payment. And you know, we're talking about children with profound and challenging disabilities. But you know, that figure does require some explanation and setting out some further detail. I just don't have that to hand, but I will come back to you. And you're right, we should always look at the evidence base of what the impact is. So I would expect, and again, if we're not monitoring this, and I hope we are, and I'll include this in the answer, that the support of child disability payment to families should be supporting families out of poverty. It should be supporting families around their mental health and all of the things that you would expect a child disability payment to help the family with, in terms of the cost of living that will be more for that family compared to another family. But the evidence should be there. Now, I would expect that is being gathered, but I will check and I'll come back to you on the substantive.
I think the principles, generally speaking, have good cross-party agreement. What is perhaps the real issue is about deciding, when the payments have been made, just how effective they are than addressing the specific problems that have manifest themselves within the welfare system. That's the key issue. And just on this basis, Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government's good reasons or bad reasons has made its voice known very strongly about the mitigation of the two-child cap. That's not new. That's been going on for quite some time. Can I ask you, why was it that you decided to introduce mitigation for the two-child cap just now, when it wasn't meeting the deadline that the Scottish Fiscal Commission had to work to? Why was that decision made, and therefore involved the SFC having to come back last week to say that their projections is going from 155 million in 2026-27 up to the 198, I think it is, for 29-30. Why did that happen?
So I'll come on to that. Just firstly, just one final thing on the child disability payment and disability payments and supports in general. They absolutely, they should be robust and they should be consistent, and they should meet with the test of that this is support for families who are under extraordinary pressure with day-to-day lives because of the disability of a child, and therefore the processes of determination should recognise all of that. But the answer, I'll come back to you with the answer to the why the big increase, because there will be a rationale for that. In terms of two-child cap, I mean, I touched on this earlier on around the decision-making. You know, bluntly, the First Minister challenged all of us that he didn't feel that as we worked through the budget to get it to its, you know, what does it look like, the shape of it, he felt we were not going as far as we needed to go on child poverty and tackling child poverty. And he challenged us all to look again at what more could be done. And there are various options, we touched on them earlier on, around, you know, do you increase Scottish Child Payment, or do you do something that is more impactful and more targeted? And the conclusion, looking at the options in front of us and some of the evidence presented by child poverty organisations, kept bringing us back to the two-child cap. Now, I apologise to the Scottish Fiscal Commission for, you know, the point at which we made the decision, right, this is what we're going to do, to the communication of that. And, you know, given, if I'd been asking them to cost it with implementation 25-26, I think there would have been a pretty significant issue. Given the costings are for 26-27, they have been able to provide that in good time for the stages of the budget in February. And, you know, and I said it's not ideal. We would have wanted, with all things being equal, to have given them a heads up before that. In terms of the costings, in the interviews I did on the budget statement day, I had talked about a range of between 100 and 150, because we were based on figures that had not been through the Scottish Fiscal Commission's costing analysis. So the 155 is at the upper end of that. I accept that. You know, we now know the costings that we're working to in terms of making provision within the 26-27 budget. So I hope that's a kind of honest kind of laying out of the various steps of how we got there.
Finish on the question that I asked your colleague Shirley-Anne Somerville last Thursday, that the Scottish Government's arguing that these policy choices are about investment, namely the return on that investment presumably wouldn't be due in this forthcoming budget, be years ahead. Can I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, directly, where is the money coming from to fund this very substantial increase in social security?
So, in general terms, you know, this is about priorities. So we have
money coming from. I accept it's about priorities, which I might disagree with, but where is the money coming from to fund the immediate considerable uplift?
Are you talking about in terms of 26-27 for the
yes, and the foreseeable future that the Scottish Fiscal Commission has set out right up to 2029-30?
Well, it will be through, first of all, the prioritisation of that policy, but also the other steps that I laid out around fiscal sustainability. You know, do I accept that, you know, we've got to create the headroom through changes elsewhere in the way we deliver services for all of our policies? Then yes, I do. And I set 7 of those out earlier on that I'll come back to and return to in more detail in the fiscal sustainability plan. But, you know, essentially, you know, whether it's workforce, whether it's public service reform, whether it is efficiencies, doing things differently, health and social care reform, all of which will help to reduce the costs and make sure that we're delivering and prioritising not just social security investment, but frontline service investment.
Tax changes and no changes to public expenditure then to fund these?
Well, I've already set out the tax position that we're not changing rates and bands for the duration of this Parliament. Obviously, I can't speak for another administration beyond May 2026. But, you know, this is, if you look at and I'm going to kind of, you know, the scale of the Scottish Government budget, not something you really I would express in these terms because there are constraints, but it is still a very small element of the overall budget. Does it mean, though, that we don't have to make changes elsewhere? No, and we should be making those changes anyway. We should be driving efficiencies. We do have to change the size and shape of the workforce, because we do, for all the reasons we understand in terms of sustainability and affordability going forward. And reform and delivering public services in a different way is the right thing to do, whether or not we needed to create headroom for social security support. It's the right thing to do anyway, because it's more efficient and delivers a better service to the public. So I will come back to that in some detail in the fiscal sustainability delivery plan alongside MTFS.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good afternoon. In fact, it's been a long morning for everybody. Just some general questions from myself. First of all, in terms of where we are in terms of the process of the budget and the final vote. I mean, obviously, there's still discussion going on underway, at least with some of the other parties. And I appreciate you won't be able to give the details of that, but I'm interested in getting a flavour of what type and extent of changes you might anticipate until we get to that end point. Can you give us any more insight?
So discussions are ongoing. In fact, I've got my next round on Thursday, and I think that's the 4th engagement we've had. I'll be corrected if I'm wrong on that, but I think it's about the 4th. And actually some of that engagement, not just with parties, but with stakeholders, were reflected in what was contained in the budget statement itself. So we didn't, there's always a balance, isn't there, of what do you put in the budget statement and what it might be held back because you anticipate that it's going to become a budget issue. And we actually very much kind of front-loaded the budget statement with what we kind of set out of the key planks of where we're investing and what the priorities are. But the discussions are very positive, and I'm not going to obviously divulge the detail, but you'll have heard opposition politicians talk about their priorities in the chamber, so it won't be of any surprise of what those areas are that they might want us to go a little bit further on. But it's not about fundamental unpacking of the budget statement and replacing. This is around the edges of, if there's a view that we need to go a bit further on this, then those are the types of discussions that we're having, and they're very positive, and it's a good thing. I'm said from the start I want to try and build as broad support for the budget as I can. I think that it would be a good thing in the current political climate.
Yeah, and I won't press any further than that. I suppose the main reason I was asking was that I personally was heartened by the renewed focus on growth in this budget and the sentiment that's been occurred that. And the reason I'm asking, therefore, is I anticipate that the asks will be in spend, and therefore it's protecting this focus on growth that I'm really asking that question, that can continue. Yeah.
Let me give you assurance, we will not be unpicking the investments that we're making, whether that's in green energy or in enterprise and all the other supports that we are put in place, because we recognise the importance for growth. So those will absolutely be there. And the investment in infrastructure is the biggest growth enabler. So the investment in affordable housing that we're now able to make, because of the change in capital budget trajectory, and obviously we hope that that's going to continue through spending review, question mark, we'll need to wait and see. But it's important because these are absolute levers for growth. So there's not going to be any unpicking of that. It is really very much around the margins.
Okay. And actually, you probably guessed that I might pick up on a couple of these things. You mentioned housing yourself and the figure. I mean, obviously, it's a big increase in the budget and a big increase for affordable housing. I suppose the question, I very much welcome that. Can the benefits that this bring, these multi-factor economic benefits of house building in particular, can it be quick enough? Can it be done quickly enough? Because obviously it's fundamentally going to attract in private capital. So it's not just about building more houses quickly enough. it's also attracting private capital, and the sense of ambition and the sentiment, the mood music, if you like, that the government's giving out. So do you think that can be done quickly enough that we start to see real figures emerging in terms of actual delivery against projections? And do you think that will result in quicker progress in attracting some of the organisations that are at the table in terms of critically build to rent, for example?
Yeah. So a lot of it's about certainty and confidence, isn't it?
Yep.
And I think the feedback from not just the housing sector, but from some investors as well, is that this is a really important move to give that confidence and certainty. But certainty, and it brings me back to the point about the spending review, the best certainty we could give is to give multi-year certainty. Now, we have to wait till the spending review in June to see what the trajectory of capital is looking like. Now, I do have worries around current market and what the Chancellor may or may not do, given she's kind of boxed herself in to very limited room for manoeuvre. I would be concerned if the outcome of that was, a different trajectory on both resource and capital. But we'll see in June, and obviously she's going to she's likely to say something in March as well. So I do have some concern. The investment of that money, some of it will be longer term because obviously starting to build new housing has a lead-in time, but it's also for things like voids. So getting motoring with RSLs and councils, getting those voids turned around. So I saw a council was employing some additional tradespeople, I can't remember which one it was now, in order to help get those voids turned around, because you're sitting with thousands of voids and we've got families in temporary accommodation. We need to really get those properties turned around. So that can happen in the short term, as can acquisitions off market. But new build really is important. One of the issues will be, of course, the cost of new build. And construction inflation has meant that unit costs now are just way in excess of what they were. So we have to be realistic.
I'm sorry, folks, I'm going to have to call a halt, or we're going to be in breach of standing orders. So I do apologise. All I can do at this point then is thank the Cabinet Secretary for evidence. We'll consider the evidence received and publish a report on the Scottish Budget before the end of this month. That concludes our meeting for today. Thank you very much, and apologies for that, Michelle.